My grandfather never talked about the lake property. Not once. Not in 32 years of Sunday dinners, not in the long drives up to Muskoka when I was a kid, not even on the afternoon he sat me down and told me his heart was giving out and he didn't have much time left. He talked about a lot of things that day. The price of lumber in 1987, whether the Leafs would ever get their act together, how my grandmother made the best butter tarts he'd ever tasted, and he'd never told her enough. But the lake property? Nothing. I didn't even know it existed until the lawyer called. His name was Mr. Beauchamp, and he called on a Thursday morning in late February, 6 weeks after we buried my grandfather in the churchyard outside Huntsville. I was in the middle of a shift at the warehouse, and I almost didn't pick up. I'm glad I did. Your grandfather's estate included a parcel of land and a structure on the shore of Lac Sauvage, approximately 40 kilometers northeast of Sudbury, Mr. Beauchamp said. He left it to you specifically, not to the family, to you by name. I stood in the parking lot in -18-degree weather and asked him to repeat that. He did. I drove up there the following Saturday alone. I didn't tell my uncle. I didn't tell my aunt or my father's side of the family, who had already made it clear they felt my grandfather's modest savings should have been split evenly among everyone. They had been loud about it at the will reading. My cousin had called it insulting. My uncle had used the word greedy, which struck me as rich, considering he hadn't visited the old man in 4 years. I told myself I wasn't keeping a secret. I was just taking some time to understand what I'd been given before it became a committee decision. The drive northeast of Sudbury takes you through a kind of Canadian landscape that feels like the edge of the world. Boreal forest pressing right up to the highway, the rock face of the shield rising in gray shelves, frozen muskeg stretching out between the spruce trees. It was the kind of country that made you feel small in a way that was almost comforting, like the land had been there long before your problems and would be there long after. The GPS took me as far as a forestry road just off Route 17 before it lost confidence. The last 11 kilometers were on a gravel track with no signage, and I drove them slowly, watching the tree line for anything that looked deliberate. When I finally saw the structure through the birch trees, I stopped the truck and just sat there with the engine running. It was not what I expected. I had been picturing a fishing shack, a one-room thing with a rusted tin roof and maybe a wood stove that hadn't been lit in decades. What I found instead was a low, long building, cedar-sided, built close to the ground, set back maybe 30 meters from the lake's frozen shore. Someone had built it with serious intention. The roof was steeply pitched for snow load. The windows were small and set deep into thick walls. There was a covered porch along the south-facing side, and even under the snow and the gray February light, I could see that the bones of it were sound. My grandfather had been a carpenter before he retired. I hadn't put that together until I was standing in front of the place. The key Mr. Beauchamp had given me was old, a long brass skeleton key with a loop handle, and I half expected it not to work. But the lock turned smoothly, like it had been oiled recently, which didn't make sense. My grandfather had been in the hospital for 8 months before he passed, unless someone else had been here. I pushed that thought aside and went in. The inside smelled like cedar and something else. Machine oil, maybe, or the particular dryness of a space that's been kept heated just enough to prevent damage. And it had been heated. There was a propane wall unit near the door, and when I checked the tank outside, it was 2/3 full on a timer system. My grandfather had been paying to keep this place from freezing, even while he was dying in a hospital bed in Huntsville. That hit me harder than I expected. The main room held a workbench along one wall, shelves of neatly organized hand tools, and a small table with 2 chairs. At the far end, a narrow hallway led to a sleeping room with a single cot and a wood stove. There were no photographs, no personal items that I could see. The whole place had the feeling of a workshop rather than a retreat. Functional, deliberate, stripped of anything unnecessary. I walked the length of it twice before I noticed the floor. In the main room, under the workbench, there was a seam. Not a floorboard joint. I know what those look like. I grew up watching my grandfather work wood. This was a deliberate seam, cut in a rectangle about a meter wide and 2 meters long, with a slight countersink along one edge where something could catch. I crouched down and ran my finger along it. The fit was so tight I almost missed it, but when I pressed the countersunk edge, something disengaged with a soft click, and the panel lifted an inch on a pneumatic hinge. I sat back on my heels and looked at it for a long moment. My grandfather had been a quiet man. He came from Timmins originally, the son of a Finnish immigrant who had come over to work the mines. He'd spent his 20s doing carpentry across northern Ontario, then settled in Huntsville, met my grandmother, raised my father and my uncle, and lived what looked from the outside like a very uncomplicated life. He watched hockey. He kept a garden. He drove the same pickup truck for 19 years. There was no version of him in my head that came with a hidden floor compartment in a secret lake property. I lifted the panel the rest of the way. Below it was a metal box, the kind of thing you'd use for document storage, gray fireproof, with a combination lock on the front. Sitting on top of the box was a white envelope with my name written on it in my grandfather's handwriting. Just Milo, not Milo Hartwell, not to my grandson. Just my name, like he'd left a note on the kitchen counter. My hands were not entirely steady when I opened it. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten on the same lined paper he'd used for grocery lists and hockey pools my whole life. I recognized his handwriting. Neat, angular, slightly left-leaning. He'd always said the nuns at his school had tried to correct his left-handedness and never fully succeeded. Milo, it began. If you're reading this, then Mr. Beauchamp did his job and you found your way up here, which means you're braver or more curious than most people in this family, and I always knew you were both. I have some things to tell you that I should have said in person. I tried a few times and lost my nerve. You'll understand why when you finish reading this. The combination is the year your grandmother and I were married, forward and back. I set the letter down on the workbench and stood there looking at the box for a while. Outside, the wind had picked up off the lake and was finding the gaps around the window frames. The propane heater ticked. I thought about calling someone, my father, my friend Darren, who was the most sensible person I knew, someone who could sit beside me while I opened a box that my dead grandfather had hidden under the floor of a secret cabin 40 kilometers outside Sudbury. Instead, I turned the dials, 1959, then 9591. The lock released. Inside the box was a bundle of documents held together with a binder clip, a USB drive in a small plastic case, and a second envelope, this one sealed with wax. On the outside of the sealed envelope, in my grandfather's hand, for the RCMP, open only after reading the documents. I sat down on the floor of that cabin, on the cold pine boards, and I started to read. It took me most of the afternoon. My grandfather's name was Aino Hartwell. Aino was Finnish, and he'd anglicized the pronunciation so long ago that most people didn't even know. What I did not know, had never been told, was that in the late 1970s and early 1980s, before he settled in Huntsville, he had spent 3 years doing carpentry work for a man named Morrow. I'll call him that, because the legal case is still ongoing and I've been told not to use the full name. Morrow ran a legitimate-looking property development company out of Sault Ste. Marie, building hunting and fishing lodges across northern Ontario for wealthy American and southern Ontario clients. Except that the lodges were not the point. What my grandfather described in those documents, in his careful angular handwriting, was a money laundering operation that had been running since at least 1976. The lodges were real. He built them, and they were beautiful, but the financials behind them were not. Cash from sources he was never told came in, got laundered through construction contracts and property sales, and came out clean on the other side. He was paid in cash and told it was a tax efficiency measure. He was young, he needed the money, and he believed it. The moment he stopped believing, it was a Thursday afternoon in October 1981, when he was finishing trim work in a lodge near White River and overheard a conversation he was not supposed to hear. 2 men he'd never seen before. Numbers that didn't belong to any construction project he'd been involved with. A name that, he wrote, I recognized from the news, and the news had not been good. He left that job on a Friday and never went back. He moved to Huntsville, met my grandmother at a church social 6 months later, built a quiet life, and never spoke of it to anyone. But he kept records. That was the thing about my grandfather. He kept everything. Carbon copies of contracts, invoices with discrepancies he'd circled in pencil, names and dates in a small notebook, and, most critically, a set of photographs he'd taken with a Kodak Instamatic of documents he'd seen lying on a desk in Morrow's site office one afternoon when he'd been left alone briefly. He didn't know exactly what he was photographing. He just knew something was wrong, and that some part of him wanted proof he could barely articulate. He had carried that proof for 40 years. He'd built this cabin himself, on land he bought quietly and registered under a numbered company. A numbered company, my retired carpenter grandfather who grew up in Timmins, because by the time he understood what he had, he was also afraid of what it meant. He was afraid for my grandmother. He was afraid for my father and my uncle when they were born. And then, he wrote, the years went by the way years do, and the fear became habit, and the habit became silence. But I never threw anything away, he wrote. I don't know if what I have is still useful. I don't know if the people involved are still alive. But I know I've been carrying this wrong for a long time, and I'm tired, and I trust you to know what to do with it. I'm sorry I didn't tell you in person. I didn't know how to start. I drove back to Huntsville that night in the dark, with the metal box on the passenger seat and my grandfather's letter folded in my jacket pocket. I drove carefully. I kept checking the rearview mirror for no reason I could rationally explain. When I got home, I called Darren. I need you to come over, I said. It's 11:30. I know. He came over. I made coffee and laid everything out on my kitchen table and told him what I'd found. Darren is an accountant. He is the least dramatic person I've ever met, which is exactly why I called him. He put on his reading glasses, went through the documents in order, and didn't say anything for a long time. Milo, he said finally. Yeah, this is some of these names. He took his glasses off and looked at me. Do you know who some of these people are? I had spent the drive home thinking about that. Some of the names I recognized from the documents were still connected to legitimate businesses. A few had died, which I'd been able to confirm on my phone during the drive. But one name, had come up in a news story about a property fraud investigation in Ontario just 2 years ago, and the case had gone quiet in a way that suggested it hadn't simply gone away. I have some guesses, I said. You need a lawyer before you call anyone official, Darren said. That's the first thing, not tomorrow. First thing. He was right. I knew he was right. What I did not count on was my uncle calling the next morning. He had gotten wind, somehow, I suspected through a relative of Mr. Beauchamp's who lived in the same town as my aunt, that I had been up to property my grandfather had left me. He didn't know about the documents. He didn't know about the cabin's hidden floor or the metal box or any of it. But he knew about the land, and he was not happy. That property belongs to the family, he said, without any greeting. Whatever your grandfather wrote in that land was built up with family money over decades, and it doesn't belong to just one person. I sat at my kitchen table with the metal box 6 inches from my elbow and listened to him. Tell me about fairness and family obligation, and what my grandmother, his mother, would have wanted. My grandmother, who my uncle had not spoken to in the last 2 years of her life over a dispute about a piece of furniture, I said, I'll be in touch, Uncle Dale. Don't you do anything with that property without consulting. I'll be in touch, I said, and hung up. I had a lawyer by noon. Her name was Miss Tran, and she had a small practice in Sudbury that handled estate and property law. I drove up that same day. I sat across from her and put the metal box on her desk and told her everything. She didn't touch the box. She listened to me, made notes, and then leaned back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Your grandfather was right to document everything the way he did, she said. The question is provenance and chain of custody, and we need to be very careful about how this gets introduced. She paused. Do you understand that, depending on what's on that drive and in those documents, this could become something much larger than an estate matter? Yes, I said. And you're comfortable with that? I thought about my grandfather, Eno Hartwell from Timmins, who kept records he was afraid to use for 40 years and built a cabinet to hold them in a secret room under a cabin he owned under a numbered company because he didn't know what else to do with a thing he couldn't put down. I thought about how he had given it to me instead of my uncle, instead of my father, instead of anyone else. I thought about what that choice must have meant. He trusted me with it, I said. That's enough. Mess Tran contacted the RCMP through proper channels. What followed was neither fast nor cinematic. There were weeks of waiting, of document authentication, of secure digital forensics on the USB drive. There was a period of about 3 weeks when I was told very politely not to discuss the matter with family members, which made Sunday dinner at my father's house an exercise in creative non-answers. My uncle called me 4 more times about the property. I didn't pick up. The photographs from the Instamatic were the key. My grandfather had somehow, through sheer immigrant son instinct for documentation, managed to capture account records that tied Morrow's operation to 3 subsequent companies that had continued operating, laundering under different structures, different names, for the better part of 4 decades. The property fraud investigation from 2 years ago suddenly had a historical thread it hadn't known to pull. I'm not going to describe the legal outcomes in detail, partly because some of it is still before the courts, and partly because my lawyer would take that badly. What I can say is that the RCMP officer who called me on a Tuesday afternoon in May, 6 months after I first opened that envelope, used the word significant contribution and then paused and added in a quieter voice, "Your grandfather was very brave to keep that material for so long. That couldn't have been easy." I didn't know what to say to that. I said, "He didn't talk about it." "No," the officer said. "The ones who carry things like that rarely do." I went back to the cabin in June, when the snow was gone and the birches had leafed out, and Lac Sauvage was the particular blue-green that northern Ontario lakes turn in early summer. I unlocked the door with the brass skeleton key and stood in the doorway for a while. The propane heater was off. The place smelled like cedar and warm wood in the afternoon sun. I walked the length of the main room and crouched down by the workbench. The floor panel sat flush and even. There was nothing below it now. I had taken everything that had been in the box, and what the RCMP had needed they had, and what remained was in Miss Tran's care pending the case outcomes. The cabin itself was mine. The land was mine. 43 square meters of honest, careful carpentry, built by a quiet man from Timmins who knew how to keep a secret and knew, eventually, when it was time to let someone else carry it. I sat on the porch until the sun got low and the loons started calling out on the lake. That sound that is so Canadian it almost feels like a cliché until you're actually sitting in front of it, and then it's just the sound of the world being very large and very old and mostly unconcerned with your problems. My uncle has since hired his own lawyer. I've been told to expect a challenge to the will on the grounds of undue influence. Miss Tran says it's unlikely to go anywhere. I find I'm less angry about it than I thought I'd be. My uncle is someone who was shaped by what he didn't receive, and that tends to make a person small in ways that aren't entirely their fault. My grandfather understood that. I think that's part of why he built his way out of it, with his hands, with his records, with one brass key, and a letter that started with just my name. I haven't decided yet what to do with the cabin. I've been up 3 more times. I fixed a section of eave flashing that had started to lift, which felt like the right thing to do. My grandfather would have noticed it. There's a question people seem to want answered when I tell this story, or part of it, to anyone. They want to know, if I had found money in that box instead of documents, would I have done the same thing? I've thought about it, genuinely thought about it. I'm 29 years old. I work at a distribution warehouse outside Huntsville, and I will not pretend that a box full of cash under the floor of a secret cabin would not have been a significant temptation. But here's what I keep coming back to. My grandfather knew what he had. He knew it had value, not just legal value, but the kind of moral weight that accumulates over 40 years of carrying something you know you should have put down sooner. He could have burned it. He could have driven it to the dump. Instead, he built a room for it and maintained the heat so it wouldn't deteriorate, and left me a letter with the combination to the lock. He was asking me to finish something he'd started in 1981 in a carpentry site near White River when a young man from Timmins with good instincts and a Kodak Instamatic had taken photographs he didn't fully understand. I wasn't going to let him down. The loons were still calling when I finally got up from the porch and locked the door behind me. The key went back in my jacket pocket. I walked to the truck through the long evening light coming sideways through the birches, and I thought about my grandfather, about the version of him I'd known, all Sunday dinners and garden rows and hockey commentary and butter tarts, and the version I hadn't known, the one who'd been carrying something heavy and quiet for longer than I'd been alive. I think about which version was more real, and I keep landing in the same place. They were both him, the silence and the records, the fear and the preparation, the years of saying nothing and the letter that said everything. He outsmarted all of them. He just took the long way around.